Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Open Source Developers at Google Speaker Series. Our guest this evening is Tim Ansell, and he will be addressing us on the topic of gaming for freedom. Tim is a recent addition to the Google engineering team and is also a graduate of the University of Adelaide, where he studied both computer science and philosophy. Should promise to be an interesting evening. Take it away, Tim.
Hi, I'm Tim, and I'll be talking about gaming and FOSS for the next 45 minutes or so. So the first thing is I'm going to assume you know what FOSS is. I'm not going to get into any arguments about beer versus freedom or which is the best open source license or anything like that. I assume that basically it's FOSS. And I also going to use a slightly different definition of computer games than most people generally think of in the media. A lot of people think of computer games as just the type of games like the first-person shooters, the big $100 million budget games. I'm going to include every type of computer game from solitaire all the way up to those big titles. So that's my definition of computer game. And that's what I'll be using when I say computer game. So the talk's divided into three kind of primary sections. The first one, I'm going to talk about why you should all care about FOSS games, whether or not you're a gamer. I'll also talk about how FOSS games are already really well established and how they're going to continue to be better and better. And I'm also going to talk about how to get involved and how to make your own games exist if you're interested in producing your own games. So who am I? Well, I've worked on FOSS games for about 7 or 8 years now. I started when I was in high school, which is pretty normal for the FOSS game developers. I started with a project called WorldForge, which was the first MMORPG project, open source MMORPG project. And then I founded a project called Thousand Parsec about I think it's going on 7 years ago, and I've been running that ever since. And because I believe so strongly in games, I've been running a thing called the Gaming Miniconf, which is a one-day event, part of Linux.conf.au, which is one of the biggest Southern Hemisphere open source conferences. And I did that in 2007 and 2008. And generally, I'm trying to give these type of talks to give people more information about FOSS games. So yes, that's me. So yes, I am an Australian. That's a picture of Australia. Because you're Americans, no, I'm not Austrian. I'm an Australian, you know, kangaroos, emus, those type of things. This talk is also very under construction. I've only given this specific talk once before, so I'm going to try and use lots of animations and other eye candy to kind of hide all the things which don't work quite yet and haven't actually been well thought out. So watch out for kind of falling slides. So the real question is why I'm giving this talk. And this kind of slide summarizes all the reasons I'm giving this talk. And I'm going to go into more detail over the next couple of slides. Just to summarize, some of the things is there's a real negative inside the FOSS community that games is one area where FOSS can't compete. And I just don't think that's true. The closed nature of gaming consoles and gaming preventing people from moving windows, they're two really important things that people seem to forget. And just that FOSS has already entered these markets and kind of working really well and getting forward. And it's people don't see this because a lot of it is fairly secretive because of the kind of high-paced industry the games industry is. And lastly, there's just so many cool games out there, and unless you've been introduced to them or know how to find them, you can often just not even see that they exist. So I personally think that FOSS is the FOSS games is the final frontier for FOSS. We're doing pretty well. Well, we pretty much own the kind of embedded and server market. We're making good penetration into just applications with Firefox and OpenOffice. And games is one area where people haven't really been concentrating. And the reason people kind of say FOSS can't compete in games is because of the large budgets. It's a high-stress industry, moves very fast. And when you look back at the early 1990s, these are all exactly the same things people were saying about Linux and FOSS. They'll never be able to create an Office suite. Nobody will be able to create a Linux that your grandma can use. Nobody will be able to do this type of thing. If you look at FOSS now, Firefox has 20% market share in the world. It's even higher in some countries. In some European countries, penetration of Firefox is almost 90%, mainly because they can't get IE in their own language. Linux revenue last year alone is considered to be $35 billion, which is 10% of the software industry's earnings last year, which I dare anybody to say that is not competing. Apache runs 70% of the internet. These aren't small pieces of software that don't do trivial things. These are full, complicated pieces of software, and games aren't that much more complicated. In games, you don't have to worry about the hundreds of Microsoft file formats that you do when you do an open source Office suite. Games, you don't have to worry about the fact that 90% of the web doesn't comply with standards that you do in Firefox. So there's no reason that you couldn't compete in games. So the question often comes up when I'm at FOSS conferences talking about computer games. They say, I'm not a gamer, why should I care? I'm into FOSS, I run Linux, I don't really care about games. There are lots of reasons that you should care, and this is probably the biggest one. I don't know how many of you have ever looked at the state of gaming consoles. But to develop for a gaming console, you have to go to the person who produces the gaming console and request permission. And Xbox and PlayStation have things like mod chips and stuff like that. But to legitimately produce a game for a console, you have to get a developer license. And this is kind of what media companies and people like Microsoft would love to do to your PC. They would love to be able to say that you can only run the programs that have paid us a licensing fee on your computer. And they've done it in the case of gaming consoles. So this is why you should be worried about open source games, because open source games are helping to fight this problem, because otherwise you can only get this content on the closed source platform, so you're forced to use it. So this is why you should worry about open source games, because otherwise you're going to end up with a computer that you can't control. The other thing is, if you care about Linux on the desktop, a a lot of people say, I don't care about games, but I want to see Linux on everybody's computer. And games on Linux are required to see a high market penetration of Linux, because at every FOSS conference I go to, people put up their hand. I do a kind of survey and they say, okay, who uses Windows? And a kind of large majority put them up their hand. And I say, who uses Windows just for computer games? And like 50% of the people in that audience still have their hand up for that. So it's preventing a large majority of people who would otherwise be completely FOSS on their desktop from moving to that. So that's why if you care about Linux on the desktop, you should care about games on Linux. So the thing, this might seem all like doom and gloom because like the closed source nature of consoles and that type of thing, but FOSS is actually already going really well. If you look at the mod chips and the open source homebrew stuff, where you could easily add in things to the gaming consoles, there are hundreds of FOSS games that you can access. They're emulators, there are full-blown games. So we're actually winning. And the great thing about FOSS is that it grows at an exponential rate. It works really well on the network effect. The more open source games there are, the easier it is to make a new open source game, which means that there are more open source games, which anybody can see is kind of a feedback loop, which is going to make making open source games much better. And if you look at the history of computer games, almost all the original computer games were open source. Things like Space War, which is often considered one of the, well, if not the first multiplayer game to exist on computers, was totally open source. Dungeon, which is one of the first text-based computer games that consumed many people's college years back in the 1980s, was open. Well, I don't know when it was produced. It was, well, that's kind of before I was born. So that was an open source game and was ported to many mainframe platforms. Mud, which is kind of spawned off a whole swath of text-based multiplayer games, was an open source game. The whole kind of Mud, Mush, Muck, and other multiplayer user games, text-based user games, all kind of have a history from this, and a majority of them are FOSS-based. And the other thing is that commercial games are already using FOSS. This is kind of something that people often don't realize, that all the commercial games out there today use some type of FOSS. The first line listed there are games which have used FOSS components directly in their software. Things like Python are very common. Python's an open source language, and they embed it because they can get access to developer resources, and it makes their pipeline much quicker. Things like in the handheld region, things like Lua and SQLite are some of the smallest and highest quality libraries that you can get for the size they are. So they're used in hundreds of games which need scripting or an SQL type database. And the other thing is stability really matters when you're running a game. If a game goes down, you get angry posts on your forums like seconds after it goes down. So a large majority of computer game companies who run things like online services do it on things like Linux and FreeBSD because they can get the stability that they matter. And they're also using FOSS internally. Things like subversion are very common in especially the Australian games industry, which is a little bit lower margin, so they can't afford things like per-force licenses. And a lot of them use subversion for media. Things like when you're doing media development in your game, you have a media repository, and there's no other revision control system which can handle the quantity of data they have. They have like 200 and 300 gigabytes worth of binary data. So they're using FOSS internally. If you look at the Sony PlayStation, it uses a GCC derivative for all their compilers. So FOSS is already being used in commercial games, and it's getting increasingly more. There are even large middleware companies which are considering open source their middleware because they make money from basically providing the middleware to companies as a kind of service. So releasing their middleware would automatically produce a whole bunch of coders who would work on their middleware, improve it, and also get the skills they need to develop the next generation of commercial computer games. This is not a pipe dream. It is happening. ID Software always releases their previous game engine under open source. There's a really huge emulator and that type of playing old games again, which is growing really well. So now I'm just going to go through kind of some proof of what I've been saying. There are FOSS games out there which are innovative, and there are FOSS games out there which do have commercial quality polish. A lot of people say, oh, FOSS games are just like, I don't know, Bubble Bobble, your casual game. There are first-person shooters out there which have as much polish as the commercial open source, the commercial first-person shooter games. So, Westnoth is a good example of a polished game. It's kind of the Heroes of Might and Magic. You've got things like a puzzle game like Fish Fillets or Enigma, Chromium, your top-down shooter, World of Padman, and Warsaw, which Warsaw is actually a great story because it's become a very strong competitive computer game. It's actually been in esports tournaments, and it has a very strong following because the type of game they wanted to make is very suited for esports. There's lots of trick jumping and stuff like this, which actually makes it quite a good game to demonstrate. We're going to put the slides up on the web, so if you want to find out more about these games, you'll be able to download them and click on the links. I'm not going to spend too much time on this section because it will get out of date. If you watch this video a year from now, the type of games that are out there will have changed drastically. There's some really quite good party games out there. Things like Threats on Fire, Step Mania, that are better or as good, if not better, than some of their commercial counterparts. Step Mania is actually used in commercial arcade games that you go to like a coin-operated arcade, you put your money in, you can actually play a FOSS game in a commercial game. FOSS games are also very innovative. Liquid Wars is a very hard game to explain, but it's not like anything else that's out there. Globulation 2 is a real-time strategy game that plays very differently to how you'd normally play a real-time strategy game. You don't get to control your units directly. This is a puzzle game that was written originally in a week, and you have to water your plants, and the way you do that is by placing these bricks which cool and evaporate steam. This is another very innovative, hardcore strategy game. It's very hard, so I've never got past the second level, but you can do things like change the shield strength and where you want to target the ship and stuff like that. So these are the places you really want to pay attention to, because these are where you can find more games. If you look at FreshMeat, which is like a very large database of Unix and open source of software, there are 2,918 games projects on there. The Linux Game Tome has a massive amount of very good games. Wikipedia has lots of them, and so does Free Gamer. That kind of, if you want to watch new and upcoming games, is a great place to see their blog post, find out what's happening. So now I'm going to talk about Thousand Parsec, because it's the game I've had most involvement with, and the game that I can give you the most information about. And this is just the nice intro movie we have for the game. So just quickly, Thousand Parsec is both a framework for building turn-based empire-building games, and it's a bunch of playable games that use the framework. It works on Mac, Linux, and Windows, and the way it works is it's kind of that any client can connect to any server. So a server could be running a kind of Star Wars or Star Trek rule set, and you can use the same client to connect to either. It downloads all the rules and configures itself so that you can play that type of game. It's kind of what I would call the web of 4X strategy games. So Thousand Parsec has been growing very rapidly in the recent years, but it took a very long time to get started. If you look at this graph here, for almost up until somewhere around 2003, 2004, there wasn't much activity. And you can see now, like most open source projects, once you kind of get over this hump, we've grown quite massively. And this is like our download history and our web traffic. And that's pretty normal for an open source game. It takes quite a long time before it gets noticed, before people start playing it and being interested in it, before a project takes off. And we have about 150K lines of code in total, of which about 50% is in C++, 30% is in Python, and the rest is in kind of Java and a whole bunch of other languages. We're fairly cross language. We have support for C++, Python, and Java, and we have people writing clients in those languages. So what helped us grow most in the recent years is the Google Summer of Code. Last year was our first year that we joined Summer of Code, and we had 4 students as part of the Summer of Code. One of the students did a massive amount of work on making it easier to make a new rule set. If you want to make a Star Wars game, it's much easier now. He wrote an integrated development environment for it. And we've started, like, our target audience being games is pretty much young people. Although older people do play lots of computer games, students tend to have much more time on their hands when they're procrastinating for exams. So we've started reaching out to students to help our development. And if you're interested in finding out more about how we're doing that, I did a podcast with Leslie Hawthorne, who is the host of this talk, and you'll be up shortly after this talk, and you can listen about some of our more experiences in Summer of Code. So last year, one student committed 20,000 lines of code in 3 months. This year, we have 8 students, and in the 2 weeks since Summer of Code started, we've already had over 200 commits. So I guess the next section is kind of to explain how we kind of grew this project, because it's okay saying, okay, here's our project, here's where it's at. What you don't see is how we got to where we are. Oh, and the other most recent really cool thing that one of the students is doing is this is what our client looks currently. It's very Windows 3.1, very utilitarian. It does work very well, but it's not very pretty. The student is using our libraries to develop a 3D client. And this is he's only been working on it 2 weeks, and this is what he's produced so far. A very 3D environment that looks like much more like a commercial game. And we hope by the end of the summer, we'll have something that looks as good, if not better, than some of the current games like Sins of the Solar Empire, or like Supreme Commander. And he's actually leveraging the same client libraries and stuff that support the kind of Windows 3.11. And just before I move on, we really need people to help us playtest. We've got coders, we've got people doing packaging. We really need people to just download and try the game and then tell us what isn't fun about it or what doesn't work. So please come and help us play. The client is one click install in Windows and Mac, and we have Debs for Ubuntu and Debian on Linux. We have eBuilds for Gen 2, and so there's some guys working on RPMs for all the other systems. So often when people say, I want to make a game, this is the general kind of post. Oh my God, let's make a really cool MMORPG. And this is not the best way to make your game. So we do need you to help contribute to it. For all the reasons I mentioned in the first part, it's also really fun to do. You get to make games that work the way you want to. I'm not a person who's strong in the dexterity. I don't play first-person shooter games very much because it's a click fest. I'm into much more strategy games. So that's what Thousand Parsec is. It's a very strong strategy game. If you're into the first-person shooting, trick jumping, you need a millisecond response time, you can make the game that way. You don't have to pander to the common denominator that a lot of game companies have to do to sell their 100 million units. If you have a niche community of 10,000 gamers around the world, you can make the game that they want to play. So my first tip for making a game is you want to release as early as possible. The first time you have something that compiles and does something non-trivial. A lot of these apply to FOSS projects in general, but games, it's particularly important because nobody will play a game unless they can actually compile and use it. A lot of games projects die because nobody sat down and released it. So that's my first tip. My second tip is that release often. A majority of people who will play your game won't check out this Subversion repository. They won't download the 100 dependencies that you want. So release a candidate often that they can play with. Even if it isn't a stable, people are much more likely to test a game and play it if they can get access to it easily, which leads into my next point. You really do need to make it easy to install. Thousand Parsec is a one-click install for Windows. It's a one-click install for Mac. On Linux, it's a little bit harder, but we're hoping to get it into the distributions. And we're trying to release like on a 6-monthly cycle now. So it gives people the opportunity to actually play what we're developing. And this is a vital of importance because if you look at, we spent 2 years rewriting our primary client. And if you look at the graph, the moment we released 0.30, which is the latest version of our client, we had a massive spike in our release. And every time we've done another release after that, we've had a massive spike in downloads. So releasing early, making it easier to download, releasing often are all tips to building your gaming community. And the other thing is that you need to promote yourself. Projects don't continue if they don't have other people working on them. You need to go out and tell people that you're actually doing this cool thing. That's a lot what I try and do with in a lot of contexts. I go out there and I just pick 10 examples, 20 examples, and promote them so that you can see what's out there. Lots of people don't realise the quality of the games out there. They don't realise that they can get first-person shooter games for free that work on their Windows or Linux or Mac. Another excuse I often hear is that I don't have the time to develop a game. When you look at Thousand Parsec, I've spent 7 years working on Thousand Parsec, and people just look at that and go, you're crazy, I would never stick with something for 7 years. But you don't have to. There are plenty of open source games that came about from these competitions. There's a thing called Pi Week, where each time it runs, you have to develop a complete runnable game in a week. That's where a lot of these really innovative games come from. Like that Nellie's Garden, I believe, came out of one of these competitions. I'm not exactly sure which one, but I know it came out of one of these. And that game is really interesting to play. If you don't have 7 days, maybe you just want to spend a weekend. The Ludum Dare gaming competition is a great way to get into it. And you don't have to have much in the terms of experience to do this. Things like Python and Pygame have meant that a person who's got a reasonable level of Python can start doing game development in under an hour. PyDay is kind of the newest one, and it only runs for 24 hours. People have to make a complete game in 24 hours, and people do. And it's really, even if you don't end up doing it, I recommend checking out these because they're a lot of really cool, interesting stuff. And the best ones always seem to continue after the conference anyway, after the competition anyway. So Python is really the key to writing an open source game quickly. People complain that Python is slow, but it's not if you do it right, for the simple reason that all your libraries are written in C++. Things like ODE or your 3D engine do all the heavy lifting in C++. You just write the game that you want to write, not caring about the 3D matrix that has to transform the camera angles and stuff like this, which makes it very quick to throw together a game. I highly recommend checking out Python for games. There are lots of stuff in other languages like Java and C++. I haven't had much experience with them, and from looking at things like the 24-hour programming game competition, there's hardly any games written in other languages just because it takes too long. So if you're using Python, I recommend that you check out Piglet. It's a very nice gaming engine that makes it very easy to write a game. The most impressive talk I've ever seen was by the two guys who wrote this. They wrote a clone of Space Invaders in a talk they were giving, a 45-minute talk. They had one guy explaining what the other guy was doing, and the other guy just sat there and typed and created Space Invaders in 45 minutes. It's up on the web if you don't believe me, you don't believe this actually occurred. There's a video of it on Google Video. Just search for Piglet. It'll be the first or second video there, and you can watch them literally create a game before your eyes. It was really, really impressive. If you don't, Piglet requires OpenGL hardware. If you're more into the 2D games or you want to target something like the old PC, have a look at something like Pygame. Pygame came before Piglet. It's a bit older and it is SDL, but it's a great way to write a quick 2D scrolling game, or it's not for your first-person shooters, it's for your kind of older games. But it's really fun to do. You can do plenty of different things, and if you go to their website, you can see what various people can do. And it's really amazing, and I highly suggest you check it out if you're into that type of game. If you're into 3D, there are also many ways that you can leverage open source projects that already exist. You don't have to write your own 3D game, 3D engine to do a game. Things like Ogre 3D, that's what our new client with all those 3D graphics is written in. It's written on top of Ogre 3D. And that guy has only had about 2 weeks worth of development time to put together that very specky looking game. Things like Crystal Space, also very good at doing computer games. They also have, like Ogre's just a rendering engine, whereas Crystal Space has all your network, it has your physics. It means you can put together a game very, very quickly. And then there's things like Ehrlich and Nebula Device. Again, they have different targets, but they do provide full support for a wide variety of things. I even believe that Nebula Device has been used in a number of smaller commercial games in Europe. It was released by a commercial game company who was using their engine to do commercial games. So you can do really advanced stuff with these things. So that's kind of the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions from anybody or just stand around and discuss your favourite FOSS games or whatever the audience wants. Questions? There's a mic behind you if you want to ask a question. Can you stand up at it? Either that or I can repeat the question if it's just short. Questions? Come on. Don't be scared.
Well, I don't have a question, but I just remind a game that you maybe didn't mention that is very similar to this SingStar game, and it's open source. Have you heard about it?
I have heard about it. I don't know its name.
Yeah, this is a game called Ultrastar, which is also open source, and you can sing and it races.
So there's a game, according to this guy down the front, called Ultrastar, which is a clone of SingStar. I know there's at least a couple of games which do very similar things to SingStar. I don't know how good it is, but yeah. Yeah?
You want me to go back there?
I'll just ask.
So you mentioned that the gaming consoles are closed today.
Yep.
PlayStation, Xbox, Wii.
Yep.
What would it take to get open source to the gaming console? Is it monetizable? Would it ever happen? And what are your thoughts?
The question was, I mentioned that game consoles are closed at the moment, and how whether or not you could get open source on these and how you might go about monetizing it and stuff like that. The biggest blocker to the open source on the console is these semi-free kits that the Microsoft and the Wii have started producing. They're kits where you can create your own game and you go through a QA process, and then if they like your game, they'll publish it on their Xbox Live network. The thing about using these is that you can only do it on their console, and they have fairly draconian in what you can do. If you want to make a satire game about something that they're quite vested in, they won't let you do that, and they won't. They basically get a lot of rights you wouldn't otherwise give away. So that's the biggest barrier to open source, because it kind of tempts people that you can write your own games for Xbox, but you can't write an open source game for Xbox at the moment. The great thing that's happening on the PlayStation 3 at the moment is that Sony have come out and said they support running Linux on their PlayStation 3. They don't give you access to the 3D accelerator on the PlayStation 3. So you've only got access to kind of the hard drive and the cell processor. But there's some pretty cool things you can do even with that limited platform. And I hope it's Sony starting to see the light that there are a lot of, you can leverage a lot of this to let people produce games for your console, which lets you sell more consoles. And once you sell more consoles, you can sell more commercial games. And how you monetize it is a question I don't really know. But I think there are a lot of games which you could distribute in terms of a client-server model, where the client and the server are both open source, but the content on the server is closed. So things like the quests that a server has, or the media, like the graphics and stuff like that, that the game has. And then that's what draws people to, you subscribe to a service rather than selling a piece of software. And I think there's a lot of potential in the MMORPG kind of market and anything along those type of lines. It does mean somebody else could come along and set up a new MMORPG with a whole bunch of different storylines, but competition is healthy, and it means you'll get more interesting games because the barrier to entry is lower. If you tomorrow turn around and decide that you have this really cool idea for an MMORPG, if the middleware is already there, you can put together it for probably $50,000 in terms of cost, which makes it a much lower barrier to entry, which means we get lots more games. At the moment, games are costing $100 million. They're on the same price as like Hollywood, which means that to make money off them, you have to sell 100 million units, which means that you have to sell your game to everyone. You can't sell it to a niche market because there aren't 100 million people in that niche market. So I think once we start seeing open source take over in that area, providing you with the tools to produce content, there's a lot of interesting things that could happen in that area. Yeah?
So it sounds like the open source game advantage is gameplay. Do you think the eye candy is ever going to catch up to the...
I do think, so the question was that with open source, the gameplay is the advantage. Do you ever think that the open source will catch up in that eye candy era? And I think, yes, it will. It might take it will take a while. I think people said the same thing in terms of eye candy on the desktop in things like 3D desktops and compositing. And Linux has shown that it can lead the way in that area. It had some of the first true compositing long before Vista was released. And it still does lots of effects that you can't do on Vista or macOS. I think that where FOSS can really go forward is in kind of generated content. Once you get to a certain level of detail, having an artist craft it by hand no longer becomes feasible because there's just too much to look at. So you start having computers assist the artist in creating the model by doing things like motion capture and stuff like that. And the price of all these things is really dropping. I can purchase a high-speed camera for $10,000 now, which is good enough to do a variety of motion capture type things. And that's dropping considerably. Sony released a high-definition camera on the market recently, which used to cost like $1,000, and it's now like $200, which is, once these tools become available and once the FOSS community starts using them, I think it will kind of start having this network effect. Once you have this person solving how to do, excuse me, skeletal animation, and this person figuring out how to do fur in real time, you then combine the two, which you can't do in a commercial setting because you have to pay him some money because he developed the fur thing. And once we start hitting that, the network effect really kicks in, and eye candy will have to be better on FOSS because of that.
How do you motion capture the camera?
You basically put like a single color on various locations on your body, and then you actually need two cameras to do like more than simple stuff. But yeah, you put the things on, and then the person moves, and then you map it to your skeleton in a character. I'm not an expert on motion capture. It does remind me of a FOSS library though called libcal3d, which was one of the first libraries ever to do skeletal 3D animation combining. So like when a person's walking, they do a motion capture of somebody walking, and then do a motion capture of somebody running. But people don't, like when moving around in games, they don't move at only 2 speeds. They move at halfway between this. So you can't have an artist generate 100 different animations of somebody moving at different speeds. So this technology was developed which allowed you to blend the two animations. And from my understanding, libcow3d was the first library to do that fairly well. And it was actually, for a long time, it was used in commercial games for this because there was nothing else out there that was affordable and did it as well. So that's an example of where FOSS works really well. So, yeah. I think the network effect means that FOSS wins full stop. It just might take a while to get there.
What about cheating? So the fact that the game is open source lowers the barrier of entry to modify, and that's sort of the spirit of open source, is to be able to modify the game. But then take a network game, if somebody modifies its client to
see through walls or something.
To change the behavior and everything, it's infinitely easier to do it with an open source game than a closed source.
So the question was, what about cheating? You've got the source code, you can modify it to do what you want, so hence you can cheat. You can do things like remove walls. This is a classic argument, and I think people have already proven that security through obscurity doesn't work anyway. So the thing games have for it is that games tend to only be around for a couple of years, so that there's not enough time for people to figure out what's happening. I think FOSS is going to have to take a different route and develop games where doing that type of thing isn't an advantage. And other things you can do, like you could have a server for a first-person shooter game which only tells you your location. So if you remove all the walls, you can't see anybody else because the server's not giving you that information. In real-time strategy games, the way you stop people cheating is by doing a simultaneous simulation. You record what people's input is, and then you play it back on both the other person's computer. So if this code isn't identical to this computer, it slowly diverges, and then you get different outcomes, and it knows somebody's not being correct. This is how commercial games even do real-time strategy games, because it allows much lower latency and means you don't have to transmit so much information. So yeah, there are ways around this, and I'm actually looking into, in my spare time, a way to do achievements in an open source environment without with being able to modify the client. So in a lot of computer games, you can, when you kill somebody, kill enemies 100 times, you get a gold star or something like this, which appears on your profile on a website somewhere that says, this guy's really cool, he's killed 100 people, or he's solved 100 puzzles, or he's done something like this. And what I'm really interested in is trying to figure out how, because the person can look inside the code, they just go, oh, for 100 achievements, all I do is post this request to the server. And it posts the request to the server, and he gets 100 achievements. So how do you solve this problem? And I think I may have figured out a way using a kind of PGP type system of a sphere of trust, like where you don't upload your own achievements, you upload achievements of others. So when you see somebody do a headshot, you upload the fact that this person has done a headshot. And then you can use this that you only upload information for people you trust. And the devil's in the details, but I think I've got a way to solve this. And it will be released in open source so that any open source game can then add this feature, and they'll be able to have this type of achievements in their games, which is...
But you could just run two clients and they each lie about each other.
Yes, but if you...
And then you can get the achievements. You know, it doesn't actually help.
But it does help, because if you have enough people, the cheaters will conglomerate in a part of a network which nobody else trusts. So you've got a chain of trust. Do you trust this achievement is determined on the fact that you trust him, who trusts him, who trusts him, and it is the same type of network of trust type thing. I haven't worked out the details. It might not work, but I'm going to give it a try in the next 6 months. I'll be interested to see what happens, even if it's a failed experiment. I don't have much knowledge of how the web of trust works in PGP, so I'm going to learn lots about that. And the great thing is PGP is open source, so I can reuse a lot of that, which means my barrier to entry into cryptography is lower than somebody who has to do it in a commercial setting, which is what I really love about FOSS.
Question.
Yeah?
Where's your paycheck come from?
I just recently started here at Google. I've been here for 2 weeks.
Okay. So this is what you said you've been working with them for 7 years?
I've been working on Thousand Parsec for 7 years, and I started that back in uni, or was it high school?
That's just all free time?
That's only free time. I've never been paid to work on open source games. That's kind of what I hope to do one day in the future. For now, not. Yes, and I'm not in the kind of whole starving person.
Right.
I kind of like my food, so yes, I'll continue to work in other areas until I can solve that problem. But it is happening. People are, at least 3 people I know who started off in FOSS now work in the commercial games industry doing various FOSS stuff. So yeah, it's happening, and I think it's an exciting time because we're kind of back in the equivalent to the kind of 1995 in terms of Linux on the desktop type thing. So we're still growing, and I think there's lots of really cool things happening. And I think like Linux and desktop is finally starting to come true. I think from now on that we'll see some interesting things. So,
cool.
Yes. Yeah.
Are there any of the big studios that are really involved with open source, like the way IBM is with Linux? Any of the game studios?
A lot of game studios like to keep it quiet because they think of it as a competitive advantage. Oh, sorry. The question was, are there any large game studios contributing to FOSS in the same way that kind of IBM and other large software industry things are contributing to FOSS? And I think people like games still have this kind of idea that they can hide things through obscurity, and they don't like to advertise the fact that all our infrastructure runs on Linux and Subversion, and we're not paying the X thousands of dollars to Perforce. So that's money we get to keep. And there's lots of kind of, and the high churn in the games industry. Most games companies don't last very long, which means that people tend to move, don't have the time to establish this. I know that a lot of gaming universities have started to establish a lot of like using open source because they can't afford to buy Unreal tournaments middleware because it costs $100,000 or something like that for a license. So they've been using things like Ogre and stuff like that to teach the students the concepts so that they can then go along and use it. And there's lots of cool stuff coming out of academia. There's also lots of cool stuff coming out from academia in a totally unrelated direction, using games for education. There's a big problem at the moment with getting women into computer science, and there's some really good stuff going on at Carnegie Mellon about making computer programming fun in terms of more interesting to different people to access it. And yeah, Alice. That's Carnegie Mellon's written this engine which is supposed to make writing games much easier, and you write it like a script in a movie or something like that rather than programming. And then after they learn all about all these concepts, you then kind of turn around and say, oh yeah, now you know how to program, because they do learn all this stuff. They just didn't realize it. There's stuff on, I don't know how well it works in Alice. I haven't had much exposure to it, but there's a really, really strong one called, I think it's RenPy. It's actually very, very popular among like in Japan at the moment, because lots of people, you write it's kind of like text-based adventure games, but with graphics. So you write a kind of script of how you want your game to get a game to progress. And these games are really, really popular among certain groups. And I believe like the penetration of that in females is the community is 85% female. And there's a huge amount of non-English stuff going on there as well. Games tend to be segregated to the English markets because of the cost of commercial computer games. They cost $50, $60. So you need to produce them in English because there's only so many people who will be willing to have that much disposable income. So yeah, it's there are lots of interesting things coming out of education. With OLPC, there's lots of interesting kind of game stuff coming up on the OLPC, specifically even using Pygame. Pygame works on the OLPC, and there's some interesting things happening there. There's just such a wide variety of things that are happening. There's a really good story about a guy who has an autistic son. So he developed a game using Pygame for his autistic son to play. There aren't that many autistic people in the world. So this game is now really popular among this niche community because of the open source stuff. He was able to produce this, and they can access it. It's like a commercial game company wouldn't come along and say, there's this really niche population, I'm going to produce a game for them, because they wouldn't see it as being profitable, whereas FOSS has been able to provide this. So I think it's probably time to wrap stuff up. Is that correct? Leslie?
It's entirely up to you if you want to take more questions, but I feel fulfilled in the amount of information we have received.
I'm going to be around, so feel free to come and chat to me personally or argue with me with stuff you don't agree with, or
I highly recommend arguing with him. It's a lot of fun.
correcting me on like various things I've got wrong. I mean, I'm not perfect, and there's just so much going on that I'm sure everyone in this room has seen something in the FOSS world that I've yet to come across. I've been doing this for like 8-9 years, and every FOSS conference I go to, there's at least 2 or 3 projects I go, wow, I wouldn't think that's possible, or wow, I didn't know people were working on that. I didn't think people could work on that. So it's a pretty cool time to be involved with it. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you have a good afternoon.